As I mentioned in the main lecture, I want to wrap up this discussion about the economic history of Latin America during the Cold War, talking about the cycle of revolution and reaction. Despite the electoral success of populism, where we have spent the main lecture, much of the next decades in Latin America after 1954 will be shaped by a cycle of revolution and reaction. Why we are going to have this cycle is a consequence of many complex reasons. Some are directly linked to the Cold War, as I explained at the beginning, but some others go back all the way to the colonial period. This is, however, something well beyond what we can consider here. So let me just take this cycle as given and describe how it affects the economic performance of Latin America. Interestingly, the first act of this cycle of revolution and reaction happens in a small peripheral country that has not played much role so far during this course, Guatemala. Guatemala had a long series of dictatorships, the last of which was the Jorge Ubico regime. This regime is thrown away on July 1944, followed by a number of short-lived governments. These short-lived governments are themselves thrown away by the October Revolution in 1944, led by Jacobo Arbenz, a young military officer, and Francisco Javier Arana. This is a photograph of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who will play a role later on in our discussion. This October Revolution is going to be followed by the start of a democratic period in Guatemala and a process of two clean and democratic presidential elections. The first was won by Juan José Arévalo. Juan José Arévalo was a teacher from middle-class origins that was the defender of something that he called spiritual socialism. It was never very clear what he meant by that, but probably he had in mind some type of mildly inclusion of all the different ways or different groups of Guatemalan society in the political and economic process, and something perhaps somewhat related with social democratic states in Western Europe. Although, as I was saying before, it was never very clear. Juan José Arévalo wins the elections because there are very, very deep reasons for unhappiness within Guatemala, and in particular with the position of the United Fruit Company, which at that moment dominated the production of bananas and to some degree other small fruits in Central America. The vagrancy laws, which were instruments used to force people of indigenous origin into working for the big latifundistas, the big landowners, at very low wages and have relatively low or very little labor rights, and in general political repression. Juan José Arévalo's government is going to address this unhappiness with a set of policies, out of which I'm going to highlight three. First, labor reform by creating a Código del Trabajo, a statute of the workers that will give basic labor rights to workers, to unions, and eliminate the vagrancy laws that, as I was saying before, were used to facilitate labor coercion, especially of those of indigenous origin. Then he's also going to create the Guatemalan Institute of Social Security, an Instituto Guatemalteco de la Seguridad Social, to provide services such as old-age retirement and health services, and is also going to create the National Indigenous Institute, an Instituto Indigenista Nacional. Guatemala is one of the countries in Latin America with the largest percentage of population of indigenous origin, many of them of different groups related with the original Mayas, and those groups have been radically excluded from the working of society, from the political process and the center of economic life for many, many generations. Juan José Arévalo, however, is not a particularly successful president, and many of his promises end up being more aspirations than realities. Then it's not surprising that his successor, Jacobo Arbenz, which, remember, was the military officer that had led the October Revolution in 1944, wins the presidential election in 1950 with a program of deepening Arévalos' reforms and pushing them further with a very large majority. Arbenz is a very interesting person. On one hand, as we will see in a moment, many of his economic policies are quite moderate. On the other hand, he also pushes for a very, very strong nationalist rhetoric. And we will see in a second how this is actually going to come back to haunt him. In terms of his economic program, he had mainly three pillars. First, a big process of land reform, the Decree 900, Decreto 900. The idea was to take the land owned by big landowners that was not being used properly or that was left unexploited. So in that sense, the land reform is not going to take away any of the land that is being used, only the land that was not being used, and it's going to be given to farmers in usufruct. Usufruct, for those of you who do not know the legal term, in Spanish, and I think as well in Portuguese, is usufructo, means that you have the right to use the land and to enjoy the benefits of the fruits that produce it. Usus, from Latin, from to use, fructus, from the fruits of that land, but you cannot sell it. In that sense, that reform is very different from previous agricultural reforms in Mexico and Bolivia that have created cooperative or state-owned systems of agricultural exploitation. Here, the idea is to have individual farmers, perhaps loosely organizing some cooperatives to exploit their own farms. And the payment to landowners will be in interest-bearing bonds. In that sense, the land reform that Arbenz designs is very similar to similar reforms that happen, a similar reform that happened in Taiwan, and that many economic historians have highlighted as an important step in the process of economic modernization of Taiwan. Also, Arbenz wants to create a public-owned utility that will generate electricity required for economic growth using an hydroelectric dam, Hurun Marinala, and in the area of transportation. As you probably know, Guatemala has a coast to the Pacific and a coast to the Atlantic. At the time, there was only one harbor in the coast to the Atlantic that was owned and operated by the United Fruit Company. What Arbenz wants to do is to have a new road to the Atlantic and a new port, Santo Tomás de Castilla, which will break the monopoly that the United Fruit Company had both on the port but also on the railroads, since they also exploited the railroads in Guatemala through a special concession through a different company, but it was also owned by the same shareholders. And in that way, allow Guatemala to have a much better position to deal with international trade. If you think about it, positions number 1 and number 3 are, I would say, quite moderate and well within what many other countries at the time are doing, even in East Asia. And even 2, you can argue, makes sense in a small country that may want to have its own utility company, in comparison with a situation at the moment where the electric utility was also controlled by the shareholders of the United Fruit Company. But these, which could be relatively sensible economic reforms, are wrapped all the time in this very strong nationalistic rhetoric, which makes the situation a little bit confusing. It looks like Arbenz wants to do much more than what he actually pretends to do. And that leads to a process of increasing polarization, a lot of unhappiness by the old elite in Guatemala, and also a lot of unhappiness within the US. In particular, Arbenz is very unlucky because that's the moment where the United States is really extremely worried about the Cold War. Remember, this is just more or less at the time of the Korean War. And also because the Dulles brothers are at that moment the Secretary of State of the United States and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the CIA. And why this is important? Well, because the Dulles brothers were actually some of the main legal counsel of the United Fruit Company. in the past. Basically, what they find, or the situation in which they find themselves, is that one of the companies that had give them a lot of businesses in the past now is being attacked by Penn, by his decisions, for instance, of create a new port and a new road, and that that leaves them in a kind of a difficult situation. And this is at the very same time where, in addition to it, there are suspicions that Arbenz may be related or maybe have strong links with the communists. At that moment, the communists were a very small party in Guatemala, Partido Guatemalteco del Trabajo, but it is the case, in fact, that Arbenz is using the help of this Partido Guatemalteco del Trabajo in many of his actions. So in some sense, we have this very nasty situation where what Arbenz is trying to do makes a lot of sense and is actually quite moderate, but on the other hand, he's trying his best to present it to the rest of the world as very nationalist and even with influence from the communists. And on the other hand, you have the United States that doesn't really understand the situation in Guatemala very well, and with two top people in policymaking, the Dulles brothers, who actually have a lot of personal connections with Guatemala and are unhappy with what Arbenz is trying to do. And that's why the CIA will organize a coup in 1954. They will pick an unhappy military officer, Castillo Armas. They will create a mercenary army under his nominal command, and those will invade Guatemala, and Arbenz will leave. And this new coup and the regime of Castillo Armas will be followed by a very harsh repression that will open a cycle of violence and civil war that lasted in Guatemala until the 1990s. And it was probably one of the harshest and most violent situations in all of Latin America during the Cold War. And it was particularly brutal in terms of the repression for the indigenous people. Well, not only this is going to have a direct effect in Guatemala and opening a very, very tense situation in Guatemala that will last for decades, but it also has an impact across Latin America. A lot of will-be reformers in Latin America look at Guatemala and they say, look, we try to do something relatively mild, like the land reform, the public-owned utilities, and the transportation, and what we find ourselves is with a coup organized by the United States. In fact, one of the persons who is at that moment in Guatemala, just out of random chance, is Che Guevara. And for him, the fact that you cannot really push this reformist movement in Guatemala is going to have a deep impact. And that's one of the reasons later on, one of the lemmas that you are going to see in the Cuban Revolution, to which we are going to come back in a second, is Cuba no es Guatemala, Cuba is not Guatemala. There was the feeling that unless you become a strong revolution with a very authoritarian regime, you are going to be overtaken by the coup. Arbenz, until the very last moment, was a strict follower of the democratic process. He didn't shut down the newspapers of the opposition, etc. And the way that Guevara is going to interpret this is that if you want to make the revolution, you cannot allow the opposition to exist, because even if they look like a democratic opposition, in any moment they are going to turn around and they are going to become counter-revolutionary forces. If you want to read a little bit more or learn a little bit more, let me give you a couple of recommendations. There is a very nice 3-part documentary on the life of Arbenz that you can find in YouTube. It was made by the Universidad San Carlos in Guatemala. To be honest, it's very interesting. It's well done. They interview a lot of people. It's a bit biased. It's a little bit too much pro-Arbenz. It never recognizes some of the problems that Arbenz have. For instance, it never gets into, it portrays an extremely rosy picture of the relations with his wife. Well, actually the wife was not very nice with Arbenz, and part of the problems that Arbenz had was precisely because his wife was cheating on him with her German teacher. And it's also a little bit uncritical and never accepts that Arbenz actually made a few negative moves. If you want a little bit more of a half fiction, half history approach, Mario Vargas Llosa has a really, really wonderful novel called Tiempos Recios, where you will really get a very good feeling about Guatemala in 1954 and everything that happened at the time. And I was saying that this was really a very negative situation because things could have gone in Guatemala in a very different way. And in that sense, I think there is a very interesting comparison, which I have not seen in the literature enough with Costa Rica. Because in Costa Rica, what you are going to have is Jose Maria Figueres Ferrer, which is this chap. He was called, Jose Maria, he was called Don Pepe. And this is a nice biography by Charles Ameringer. And Jose Figueres is going to be able to do many of the same reforms, even not more advanced than the ones that Arbenz wanted to do and Arevalo wanted to do in Guatemala, but he's going to know how to deal with the United States. He's going to be able to sit down with the United States and calm them and say, look, we are not communist, we are not going to do anything crazy, and not have the same type of a little bit silly nationalist rhetoric that Arbenz has. If you are interested in this, again, go to YouTube and put any of the speeches of Arbenz. You will be able to find a few, and you will realize how in some sense Arbenz is trying to sound way more revolutionary and way more radical than he is, and for what particular good reason. And that's a little bit what I'm trying to emphasize over here, that Latin America is going to get into the 50s in this cycle of polarization between reaction and revolution that at the end of the day is not really helping anyone. But I already mentioned the importance of Guatemala in the Cuban Revolution. So let's focus on what is the archetypical or the paradigmatic example of revolution in Latin America, which is the revolution in Cuba. January 1st, 1959, I guess one of the few dates that everyone remembers in Latin American history. Fidel Castro troops from his 26th of July movement, the Movimiento 26 de Julio, entered into Havana. Batista, a few hours before, has left the country for the Dominican Republic. Also, the mafia kind of quickly abandons Havana. If you watch Godfather II, there is a relatively accurate, not perfect, but relatively accurate portrait of that night. Michael Corleone is at that moment in Havana and sees what is going on. So, take a look at the Godfather II. And what is really amazing about this victory of the 26th of July movement is that this triumph of the revolution is barely 2 years after the landing on December 2nd, 1956, of a very small group of soldiers and revolutionaries with Fidel under the leadership of Fidel Castro. There are tons of books about the Cuban Revolution. Many of them are in Spanish, but as we always try to do in this course, we highlight books in English so we can reach a wider audience across the world. One book is not very academic, but it's well written. It's fun to read. It's Cuba Libre, Che Fidel and the Improbable Revolution That Changed World History by Penn, Tony Perrotet. And over there, you are really going to have the feeling about how we are really talking about just a few people under Castro that land on December the 2nd, 1956, under any type of a standard military assessment of the situation. The Batista was the dictator at that moment in Cuba. The Batista regime should have been able to wipe them out without any problem, and yet they are going to be able to win. And the revolution in Cuba is also an extremely paradoxical revolution because it triumphs in one of the richest countries in Latin America. Sometimes you have this idea of revolutions as happening in very, very poor countries, in countries that are really the worst of the worst. Well, Cuba was not really one of them. In fact, in terms of income per capita, was roughly comparable to Italy and Spain. That's something really forget. Let me show you a graph with some numbers. This is from 1955 and 1925. I'm picking 1955 to predate to the beginning of the war. Remember the revolution, the landing from in Sierra Madre is in December 1956. And, by 1957 and 1958, there is a lot of strikes and problems that, lower income per capita in Cuba. So let's look at 1955. And what you are going to see is that the income per capita in comparison with the US being 100, in Italy is around 29. And if you look over here, in Cuba, it's 27. And if you look at output per worker, it's 29 in Italy and it's 33 in Cuba. And if you look at consumption per capita, it's 29 in Italy and it's 35 in Cuba. That basically is telling you that Cuba and Italy were roughly the same in 1955. I couldn't find a table that also included Spain, so you will need to take my word for it, but Spain was a little bit poorer than Italy around 1955, maybe around 10 to 15% poorer, which makes Spain quite poorer than Cuba. Okay? And that's the reason why until 1959, actually a lot of Spaniards migrated to Cuba. Even some part of my family migrated back in the day to Cuba. So when you're thinking about Cuba in 1959, you should not think about a poor country. You should think about a lower middle income country that is comparable along a lot of dimensions with the poor countries in Europe. And it's not comparable at all with Haiti or with Honduras. And this is important because if we are going to look at the economic performance of Cuba, we don't want to compare Cuba with the Dominican Republic of Haiti, because look, Cuba in 1955 was 3 times as rich as the Dominican Republic in income per capita and 9 times as rich as Haiti. Cuba was comparable at the time and only behind over here Argentina, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And that's going to be enormously important. Of course, this is just not about income per capita. If you look at many other measures of income, what you find is that Cuba really looks a lot like a poor European country. So for instance, think about issues like doctors per 10,000 people around 1955. There were 11 in Europe, 4 in Latin America, 13 in the United States, 10 in Cuba. Or think about infant mortality. There was 32 in Europe per 1,000. You had 105 in Latin America, 26 in the United States, 33 in Cuba. Look at TBs per 1,000 people, 81 in Europe, 11 in Latin America, 308 in the United States, 73 in Cuba. Okay? Now, it is also true, and we need to be absolutely open about it, that Cuba was a very unequal country. And that's going to be part of the story behind the revolution. There is a big divide between urban and rural. So Havana was a very different place than in the middle of the Sierras, and also a very big division between whites and blacks. And you can see that in the literacy rate. In Europe and in the United States was 99%, in Cuba was only 79%. Okay, so countries like Italy and Spain had a much better performance at 79%, and this low level of literacy in Cuba was very much linked with, as I was saying before, the access rural versus urban and black versus white. So if you were a rural black, your probability of being literate was an order of magnitude lower than your literacy rate if you were white and urban. Okay. Also, and this is very important, Cuba was very, very dependent on sugar and tourism, its 2 main exports, with, of course, the famous presence of the mafia in Havana, which I already mentioned before. So, for instance, you can see over here the evolution of GDP and the industrial production in Cuba since around 1978. And what you are going to see are big dips over here, and big dips over here, and big dips over here. And those are always going to be directly linked also in terms of income per capita with the price of sugar. So when sugar is booming, Cuba is doing very well. When sugar is going down, Cuba is not doing so well. And you can see exactly this in the terms of trade. And you see the big drop in the terms of trade during the Great Depression that we have already observed. If you want to also learn about the presence of the mafia in Cuba, there is a very nice book by T.G. English, Havana Nocturne, how the mob of Cuba and then lost it to the revolution. Well, the title is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's really a very nice and interesting book about how Lansky and other mafiosi from New York were able to open big casinos in Havana and make a lot of money out of them. It's actually quite interesting from a pure economic perspective, and if you will, I hope you will forgive me for a few seconds, because Lansky, one of the things he's going to always insist is that he wants his casinos never to cheat his customers. You will say, why? No? And the argument of Lasky was, no, you make so much money. The casino is such a great business that you actually make more business out of having a reputation of being honest with your clients, which I thought it was a very nice illustration of how someone who was a killer and a mobster yet had an incentive to behave properly in a world where reputation matters. And what's going to happen basically is that in Cuba, there is a lot of unhappiness about the fact that you depend on sugar, not because sugar is just sugar, but because it has these wild fluctuations in price, and tourism, in particular by the influence of the mafia. So what you're going to have is that the 26th of July movement is going to be supported by a very multi-class alliance. You are not only going to have workers and farmers, you are also going to have middle class, you are going to have the university students, and even part of the business elite in Cuba supporting Castro and his movement. In fact, the 26th of July movement is just one among several opposition groups. It's going to be the most relevant one, and Fidel Castro, with his charisma, is going to become the leader. But you should not forget that there were other groups at the time fighting against Batista, and that it may well have been the case that other groups have won and kick out Batista had things gone in a slightly different way. The revolution also starts being a quote-unquote democratic revolution, but is only declared openly socialist in 1961. This is, of course, an issue that is enormously debated, and this is perhaps not the place to discuss it, about when did Fidel Castro become a Marxist and decided he wanted to create a communist regime. Fidel Castro gave a series of interviews to a Spanish journalist, Ignacio Ramonet, where he argues that he made this decision in 1958, before victory, but that he was cautious because he understood that he needed this multi-class movement alliance, and that being openly Marxist-Leninist in 1958 would have not allowed him to take power. Other historians have argued that this is a change exposed of what Castro really believed, that Castro was pushed into a radicalization by the response of the United States. These historians are usually very critical of how the United States handled the revolution and argue that had the United States been more positive about it, the government of the United States, Castro will have evolved into a more democratic path. I particularly don't find that argument, even if it's very popular, particularly compelling, and I tend to be of the opinion that if a main actor is very explicit and repeatedly argues that he was a Marxist since 1958, there is no good reason not to believe him unless you have a strong documentary evidence otherwise. So in that sense, I'm on the side of those who tends to think that Fidel was cautious and that he wanted to create a socialist government relatively early on. But it doesn't really matter for what we want to say. Things that we want to keep in mind. Well, first of all, that the Cuban Revolution is going to have an incredible international impact. The revolution is going to create enormous vaccination worldwide, even in the United States. You are going to have, let's go back to this photograph over here, Che Guevara over here, and Fidel Castro, wear their khaki uniforms and their berets and their beards that they have grown because when they were doing the guerrilla time, they didn't have access to shaving products. They are going to be known as the barbudos, the bearded ones. And, it's time of romanticism. And, what can be more romantic that, Castro, a very charismatic person, everyone who talked with him would come up quite impressed by the strength of his personality with this, big barbudo image and in this revolutionary affair. And those in favor of the revolution not only are going to admire the revolution, but they are going to come up with a set of lessons. In particular, they are going to learn three things. The first one, that guerrillas can win against a formal army. That even if those who came, Granma was the ship that, a yacht that took from Mexico, the revolutionaries from Mexico to land in Cuba, and it were only, if I recall, something like 82 revolutionaries. Even such a small guerrilla can win against a formal army, like the Cuban army that had the support of the United States. Second, that one does not need to wait until conditions are right for revolution. that the insurrection can create them. This is a big change with respect to the traditional understanding in the Marxist world. Marx thought that, or at least that's the standard interpretation of Marx, that revolutions come when the objective conditions are ripe for the revolution. What a lot of left revolutionaries in Latin America understand from the Cuban Revolution is that the insurrection by itself can create those objective conditions. And in fact, Che Guevara is going to be very explicit about this interpretation. He's going to call this focismo because it's the idea of create focuses of revolution that are going to change the objective conditions. And finally, that revolution comes from the countryside, which again goes against traditional Marxist interpretations that highlight the role of urban working classes in the revolutionary process. And this reading of the causes and consequences of the Cuban Revolution is going to have an extremely deep impact on a new generation of left-wing leaders in all Latin America. And perhaps the two places where they are going to have the biggest impact, also because Cuba is going to spend a lot of time and resources in supporting guerrilla groups over there, is going to be in Venezuela, where, for a number of strategic reasons, basically the presence of oil, Cuban leadership thought it could really make a huge difference all across Latin America. In Argentina, well, perhaps because Guevara was himself Argentinian. On the other hand, the US is going to become obsessed with the possibility of a second Cuba. It's going to, first try to undermine the government in Cuba, try to substitute it by a new, different government. It's going to fail miserably at it. Things like the fiasco of Bahia Cochinos, of Pig's Bay. And it's going to really do whatever it needs to do to prevent a second Cuba from happening in Latin America. And this is quite interesting, is also the Cuban Revolution is going to make much of the Latin American middle classes willing to support authoritarian regimes. A lot of the Latin American middle classes that have supported Castro when he gets to power sees what happens to the Cuban middle classes. Basically, they are expropriated and they are forced into socialism, which is not what they were expecting at the beginning. And they are going to basically say, hey, I rather prefer to live under authoritarian regime than live under a socialist country. If you want to read a little bit more about this, for instance, the enormous impact that Fidel had and the Cuban Revolution had across the world. In the US, Rafael Rojas has fighting over Fidel, the New York intellectuals, and the Cuban Revolution. And Simon Hall has this book, 10 Days in Harlem, Fidel Castro and the Making of the 1960s, about how the 10 days that Castro spent in Harlem, he is the leader of a Cuban delegation to the United Nations. They try to check in a hotel in downtown. They don't allow them because part of the delegation are Afro-Cubans. So he basically, Castro says, no, we are not going to do this. And they go to Harlem where they check in a Harlem hotel. And it's kind of a big deal at the time. And this is going to, for instance, have a huge impact in a lot of the student movements that will later lead to the opposition to Vietnam and to the events of 1968 in Europe and across the United States. With respect to the influence that this is going to have, the Cuban movement is going to have in the guerrillas, both in terms of intellectual background, but also in terms of logistic and monetary support. Timothy P. Bingham Crowley has a nice set of readings of case studies, Guerrillas and Revolution in Latin America, a comparative study of insurgents and regimes since 1956. And Sebastián Carasay has a very, I think, interesting book about the middle classes in Argentina, the Argentine silent majority, middle classes, politics, violence, and memory in the 70s, and how precisely the fear of Argentina becoming another Cuba that is going to push a lot of the middle classes in Argentina to support the military in their coup in the coup and the repression of the La Guerra Sucia, the dirty war against the Montoneros and other terrorist groups. Okay, but so far so good about background. Let's get a little bit into the economic aspects of the revolution, since after all, this is a class on economic history. Surprisingly enough, there is not a great summary textbook on the economic history of Cuba under communism. So I'm going to highlight two books that, without being perfect, they are perhaps the best sources. One is by Carmelo Mesalago, The Economy of Socialist Cuba, a 2 decades appraisal. This is a very nice book. Problem, it stops in the early 1980s, so we are not going to have anything covering the most recent period. And Neil Monery, A Tale of Two Economies, Hong Kong, Cuba, and the two men who shaped them, tries to do a comparison between Cuba and Hong Kong. The book is informative. I was not so compelled at the end of the day that really Hong Kong and Cuba were natural candidates for a nice comparison, given their differences in size, in background, geographical location, etc. But you are going to still get a bit of background information. As you probably know, and I don't need to remind you at this moment, Cuba is an issue that creates a lot of passions, both in people in favor of the Cuba's regime and in people against the Cuba regime. So it's hard to find these passionate, objective treatments, and I'm going to try my very best to summarize what we know about the issue. So first of all, let me highlight the economic policy of the revolution. When Castro enters in Havana and Batista leaves, there is a widespread consensus in Cuba, or at least among the people who have thought about the economics of Cuba, about the need of five economic goals. The first is Cuba needs fast economic growth. Yes, Cuba has been doing okay in comparison with other Latin American countries, and as I said before, even in comparison with some European countries, but it hasn't been doing so well in terms of GDP per capita since around 1946. Okay, so if you look, for instance, over here in 1925, the level is a little bit less than 100, and 30 years later, it's only around 115. So in 30 years, there has been only perhaps a 15% increase in income per capita. That's not that's not very good. It's not a fantastic performance. People feel, economists in Cuba and people who have thought about economics think that Cuba needs to do better. Also, it needs to reduce its dependency on sugar. And this is just not a pure nationalist position. It's, I think, a sensible position that says, look, we depend too much on sugar. We are too much exposed to the sugar prices, and you want to move into other industries. You want to diversify your agriculture. And also to reduce the dependency on the US. And again, I don't think it's as much as pure nationalistic rhetoric, although certainly nationalism play an important role over here, but because you are also interested in hedging your risk. If you depend too much on a country as a partner, what you are exposed is to the same shocks that this country has, and that's usually not a good way to manage the risk of your country. Also, you want to achieve full employment. Remember what I was mentioning before, this big divide between urban and rural regions and between black and whites, especially in rural regions and especially among blacks. There is a lot of unemployment, or just employment of very low quality, where you work for a few hours with very little pay. And there's the sense that you want to improve that, and also the sense that you want to redistribute income more equally. And again, this is not about as later turned out to be the case, be sure that income is distributed more equally by making absolutely everyone poor, but about trying to say, look, what can we do to leave perhaps the poorer people in society and have a more prosperous society. Okay. Now, of course, Cuba could have gone the path of a market economy after the revolution, but as I was mentioning before, the leadership, Castro, both brothers, Fidel and Raúl, and Che Guevara, and many other of the leadership think that this is not the way to go, that what they want to do is create a socialist economy. Again, you need to remember that in the early 1960s, a lot of people, even intellectuals and economic experts, thought that socialism was the future. Had you stopped your average economic professor at a top university in a lot of Western countries in 1960, this economic professor will have probably argued vehemently that socialism was the way of the future. Well, it turns out to be the case that even if we have a wide agreement about this ultimate goal, there is quite a bit of divergence in exactly how to do it. There is one view led by Che Guevara, And if you want to read a little bit about this book by L7A, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, is a good summary that is going to be extremely influential during the first year of the revolution, roughly from 1959, 1960 to 1969. Guevara wants to build the new men and women, the new socialist men and women that is going to be committed to the revolution and work very hard, not because of material incentives, but because of commitment. There needs to be a moral change on how humans behave. And also with a very aesthetic edge. One needs to be very austere in their life, in your housing, your food, your clothes, because that's the only way to build socialism. And he is going to have what I'm going to call a Maoist view. I will actually argue that Guevara was in fact a Maoist, where consciousness and commitment to the revolution can overcome any material constraints. So if we cannot build a bridge between two cities, it's not because the physics or the engineering problems are too challenging, it's because we are not putting enough revolutionary fervor on that goal. And in addition to it, he is going to build a new system called the budgetary financing system. There is an F missing over there. I apologize for the typo, which in Spanish is called the Sistema Presupuestario de Financiamiento, which basically aims at getting rid of money as a means of payment and delegate it to a pure unit of account. So the idea over here is, in the Soviet Union, you have a firm. Let's suppose you have the oil firm that produces this, the Soviet oil company that produces gasoline. And you are a transportation company, the Soviet transportation company that, has trucks and moves trucks around. Both of them are socialist economies, firms, companies, but both of them still have their own accounts and they use money to undertake transactions between them. So when the truck of the transportation company arrives to the gas station, the truck driver will pay with rubles, with cash, for the gasoline. And then, of course, all these rubles and all this cash will eventually end up in the hands of the government as consequence of some profits and losses of the firms, but we are still relying on money. And the Soviet Union opted for this system relatively early after the Russian Revolution because they realized that the previous system, what was known as the war communism, where you don't use money, was in fact infeasible. Guevara, however, has a different view. Guevara thinks, no, what we need to do is we are going to give instruction to the Cuban oil company to provide so much gas to the trucks of the Cuban transportation company, and when the truck drivers show up for the gas, he says, look, here I am, give me the gasoline, and we are not going to do any type of monetary transaction. Well, the problem of that approach is that it's actually extremely cumbersome to implement, it's full of problems, and it's going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies. And it's in fact going to be opposed by Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, which is really not one of those persons or economists that many people have heard, but that will eventually be the main economic czar, the main economic policymaker in Cuba. And you want to remember, by the way, that neither Fidel nor Raúl Castro knew much about economics. And that's an aspect where they are going to trust a lot on their advisors. And I will actually argue that Guevara didn't really understand economics at all. I show you this book by Helen Jaffray, just to put you in contact with what he wrote about economics. I think that the only conclusion that one come up after reading the book is that Guevara's understanding of economics was really childish. It's like a teenager understanding of economics, but whatever. Anyway, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, who I think was much more subtle and understood issues much better, he's in charge of the Instituto Nacional de Reforma Agraria, INRA, the National Institute for Agrarian Reform. He did have an education in economics, and he says, look, the only way you are going to make a socialist economy work is if you opt for a much more conventional Soviet-style planning. And after 10 years of trying, the failure of Guevarista's policies are going to lead to the final victory of Rodriguez's approach, which is to some extent still the way in which the Cuban economy works today. So yes, everyone knows Guevara. Not that many people know Rodriguez, but in fact, this is much more important in understanding Cuban economics. So let me quickly, now that we have discussed the goals of the revolution and the main economic views, a little bit how these things develop. And I'm going to call the first period between 1959 to 1971 the period of reversals. And this is going to be a period where there is going to be a very incoherent economic policy with very much ad hoc experimentation, as I was mentioning before, with a strong influence from Guevara's views, always with a clear idea of moving fast to a socialist economy. Okay, so yes, there are going to be a lot of change in direction. There is going to be a lot of change in emphasis on how you actually do things, but you really want to have a socialist economy as fast as possible. This is going to be also a period where there is going to be a deep transformation of an economy, as I was mentioning before, heavily linked to the US, an economy heavily linked with the Soviet Union. So one of the goals of the revolution was to eliminate the subordinate aspect of Cuba to the US, and unfortunately, that is going to only be accomplished by subordinating Cuba to another superpower, in this case, the Soviet Union. It's also going to be a period with a large migration of human capital. Around 1.3 million Cubans leave Cuba, mostly the highly skilled, including people like the first revolutionary prime minister, Jose Miro Cardona, as soon as they realize that Castro is going to renegade on his promise of running an election, a free and a democratic election, and instead organizes a much more authoritarian regime. Remember, people like Castro are recalling Guatemala. They say, no, the problem is it's not that we don't want to run a democratic election, it's that we run a democratic election. This is going to be taken advantage by the enemies of the revolution, and that's going to be the end of the revolution. The outcome, of course, in this situation of incoherent economic policy, changes from the US to the Soviet Union, and large migration of human capital is not surprising. There is a very disappointing growth in Cuba during those 11 years with declining productivity. Now, we enter here in one of the issues that is going to plague the rest of this presentation about Cuba. We don't know numbers. Okay? All the numbers that we have are very indirect. We don't have good estimates of income per capita. So a lot of the things I'm going to say are going to be a little bit more impressionistic than hard numbers. We will need to wait until there is a change of regime in Cuba to have a much better estimate of income per capita. But for all that we can tell, probably Cuba was not any richer in 1971 than it was in 1959. So I was mentioning that there is going to be a lot of changes in economic policy. Let me highlight some of the main milestones. In 1958, we are going to have the first, this should be 1959, another typo. There should be the first agrarian reform where farms larger than 400 hectares are going to be nationalized and are going to be divided, are going to be expropriated, and are going to be divided among small shareholders or given to some group of collective farming. And also, rental housing is going to be nationalized. So those who are living in the house of a landlord, and the landlord is going to lose the house and it's going to be given to the person who was living at the moment. Also, as I was mentioning before, not the deed, not the ownership, but in terms of usufruct. They are going to, 1960, we are going to have very large nationalizations, and we are going to set up, or Cuba is going to set up, la Junta Central de Planificación, the Central Planning Board of the plan, that is going to try to run the economy a little bit like the Ghost Plan in the Soviet Union, except that the lack of skilled economists means that the plan will not be able to run the whole thing with the same level of detail that Ghost Plan did in the Soviet Union. In 1961, Cuba is declared to be socialist. In 1963, we are going to have the second agrarian reform, where now it's going to affect to everything that is, and again, yet another typo over here. So let me write this properly. Farms that are larger than 67 hectares, and so let me fix this over here, 69. And in 1968, we are going to have what is known as the Revolutionary Offensive, where 55,636 small businesses, and this is a number taken directly from the official reports of the Cuban government, are nationalized. And that includes even your hole-in-the-wall small restaurant that just sells a little bit of food. That basically means that by 1968, there are next to no private businesses left in Cuba. This is a table of how things evolve. This is the collectivization percentage. In 1961, you have that around 30% of agriculture is owned by the government or by some type of collective farms, grows to 70% in 1963, and all the way to 79 in 77, where only a few small farmers keep their independent farms. In industry, we jump all the way to 85 in 1961, 95 in 63, to 100 in 68. Similar stories in construction, in transportation. There is always going to be a very, very small subset of local transportation that is still individual. Retail trade is going to only jump a little bit later to 52 over here to 100. This is the year of the big push. Banking and education, however, is going to be completely taken over already very early in 1961. That's what I was saying, that we are really having, when you look at these numbers, a very fast transformation towards a socialist goal. And then we are going to have in 1969, the so-called year of the decisive effort. This is perhaps again influenced by Mao. Mao had this idea of the Great Leap Forward of 3 years, where between 1959 and 1961, where China will get transformed. Castro really thinks, and the leadership of the Cuba Communist Party, by that time already called like that, is the year where there is going to be a decisive effort in the construction of socialism. And what you are going to have is a 10 million ton sugar harvest that is going to really provide the funds to be transformative. It's going to be an enormous effort. Labor is going to be recruited in the cities, middle class, workers, students, etc., are going to move to the fields, to the sugarcane fields, to get this incredible amount of sugar. You can see over here Fidel Castro, and where we will be on January the 2nd, cutting the sugar cane. That cutting and producing sugar is extremely labor intensive, and you need to do it very, very quickly before the sugar is lost. And what do we get? We get a very disappointing result. Not only the harvest falls well behind the goal, it's 8.5 million instead of 10 million, but also sugar price happens to be very low during those years, and Cuba cannot achieve this goal of having a transformative harvest. It's not very clear to me that had even been able to do it, it will have made that much of a difference, but that's another story. So what you're going to have basically is that by the end of 1970, the leadership of the party is going to realize Che Guevara by the time is already dead. He dies in Bolivia, as probably some of you know, that Guevara's policies, economic policies, were not to put too fine a point on it, silly, and that you need to do something different. And in particular, the only thing that you can do is go back, if you want to still be socialist, something that looks much like the Soviet Union approach. The Soviet Union had been a key supporter of Cuba since 1960, and its support had been vital to get around the US economic sanctions. And yet, the initial decade of relations is complicated. Castro is very unhappy with the way Khrushchev deals with the missile crisis in 1962. He thinks that Khrushchev doesn't really fully go 100% in support of Cuba, that Khrushchev should have kept his a strong bargaining position against the US, and if you need to have a nuclear war, so let's be it. And Cuba constantly accuses the Soviet Union of not being revolutionary enough, that the Soviet Union has become a lazy, old-fashioned great power that is not really revolutionary anymore. And in that sense, China and perhaps other revolutionary movements like in Algeria are much more committed to the progress of international revolution. That's why at the main lecture I was talking about how it is often the case that it's more Cuba manipulating the Soviet Union than not the Soviet Union manipulating Cuba. And the problem for the Soviet Union over here is, what do? You cannot really cut the ties with Cuba because it will probably mean the fall of the regime, but at the same time, you don't really have a lot of bargaining chips with Cuba to force their hand. by 1969, suddenly things have changed. And things have changed because Cubans have run their economy in such an incompetent way that they really, really need the Soviet support. And that's why Yuri Pavlov, who was a Soviet diplomat involved in dealing with Cuba, talks about the belated honeymoon of the Soviet Union with Cuba, of Cuba with the Soviet Union after 1968. Cuba breaks with China in June 1969. You probably know that since the mid-1950s, there had been a rift in the international communist movement between the Soviet Union and China, between back at the day Khrushchev and later Brezhnev and Mao Zedong. And Cuba had always tried to be careful on keeping ties both with the Soviet Union and with China. And with the pressure of the Soviet Union and the need of more Soviet Union help, China at that time could really not provide because just didn't have the technical and economic capability of doing so, then basically Cuba denounces China, breaks with them as counter-revolutionaries, and they introduce old-style Soviet central planning exactly as Rodriguez had defended pretty much from the beginning. And also in 1972, Cuba is going to join the Comecon, the Organization of International Trade among socialist countries. Okay. Now, the 1970s are going to be very hard years in Cuba. It's also years where this Soviet style is going to go together with very harsh repression of dissidents, of intellectuals, of people who did not agree with the regime along some dimensions. And the only first real economic reform is going to be the opening of farmer markets. So we are going to let farmers to go to the cities and sell some of their products. Remember that you can still keep your individual farm if you have 67 hectares or less, after the mass exodus from the port of Mariel in the spring of 1980. So this is basically, there's a moment where a lot of people leave Cuba to go to Miami, and the regime gets a little bit scared about what is going on and realizes that you cannot really continue in the same way. And at least the opening of farmers markets is going to improve the food supply situation and help survive during the 1980s. But things are going to really change dramatically after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay? At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1980, 80% of Cuban exports go to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc at subsidized prices. So basically, the Soviet Union is paying more for the sugar than the cost of sugar in the international market. And on the other hand, Cuba is importing 100% of its oil, nearly all its machinery, fertilizers, iron, foodstuff, etc., from the Soviet Union, also at cheaper prices at the international market. And all of this suddenly ends. Overnight, what you find is that the Soviet Union has disappeared, and you are not going to have these enormous, enormous subsidies. People often talk about how Cuba suffers from not being able to trade with the United States, which is absolutely true, but forget that during all these years, Cuba is getting probably more in terms of aid from the Soviet Union than any type of profit it could have got from the US had been able to trade with it. Output probably drops by around 35%. Again, it's difficult to tell. We don't know for sure, but it's a terrible moment. And anyone who is familiar with Cuba at the time knows that those were extremely hard years. Thanks to the distribution by the government, it never reaches to the level of starvation, but certainly the average Cuban is going to be very thin. They are not going to have a lot to eat, and they are just going to try to survive as best as they can. And the government tries to survive this so-called special period, opening to new sources of revenue like tourism. They are going to facilitate the remittance from Cuban diaspora, especially from Florida. The best way to survive the 1990s in Cuba with some comfort was to have relatives in Miami that will send you some dollars, which will allow you to get pretty much whatever you wanted in the island, and allowing for some small businesses and self-employment. But really what is going to save, I think, Cuba from total collapse is Hugo Chávez's election in Venezuela. Hugo Chávez is a big admirer of Castro and the Cuban Revolution and of his nationalist opposition to the United States. And Venezuela and Cuba are going to get an agreement where Venezuela is going to export a lot of oil to Cuba at a very favorable price in exchange for doctors, for medical doctors that will go to the poor neighborhoods in Venezuela and provide health services. I already told you before that Cuba, even in 1959, before the revolution, had a lot of doctors, but later the revolution spent a lot of time and effort in medical schools. So Cuba has a huge number of medical doctors and on security services. Cubans are pretty good at, and Cubans really know. It's kind of not quite sure why, but they really know how to run secret operations. They really know how to be very, very good spies, and they are very useful for Chavez to organize his security entourage. After Fidel Castro retires from front row of government, Raúl Castro is going to allow for a few new reforms, although the momentum of these reforms seem to have slowed down. It's really difficult to assess economic performance. We don't have very good data about income per capita in Cuba. They don't use the standard, Cuba doesn't use the standard national income and product accounts, and that most other countries in the world use. They use an alternative Soviet-based national accounting. The data does not really make a lot of sense, especially over the last 10 years. It implies very fast rates of growth, which anyone who has been on the ground on Cuba thinks is not the case, because you just don't see in terms of the production of goods, or in terms of the energy consumption, in terms of the day-to-day life of people. But by and large, at this moment, Cuba is probably quite a poor country in Latin America, and far from being, as I was saying here, one of the richest countries in Latin America. Now is probably one of the poorest. And even if sometimes the revolution is defended in terms of their improvements in things like life expectancy or infant mortality, my reply is always, no, you don't want to compare the level of Cuba life expectancy now or infant mortality now. You want to compare where Spain or Italy were in 1959, which were behind Cuba, and where Italy and Spain are now, which is well ahead of Cuba. Okay? You don't want to compare the infant mortality of Cuba with Haiti or with the Dominican Republic. Cuba was already much better than Haiti and Dominican Republic in 1959. You want to compare Cuba with Spain or Italy. And along that dimension, Cuba has done quite poorly in infant mortality and life expectancy. And in terms of income per capita, Cuba did pretty badly. So it's very hard to come up from reading the history of the Cuban Revolution without considering that its economic performance has been a big failure. And this goes to a point made by a very famous political scientist, Charles Lindblom, that talk about how some socialist regimes like the Soviet Union or Cuba have strong thumbs but no fingers. What that he means is communist regimes are very good at organizing big drives, like literacy. Okay, so we get what they will call the brigadistas, which were like middle-class students that will go to the countryside and teach people to read. Okay, they can organize that. It's kind of a military operation. We get 100,000 brigadistas, we send them to the countryside, they teach people to read. Or sending 50,000 medical doctors and improve medical services in the countryside, which does very well in terms of life expectancy and child mortality, infant mortality, but they don't have fingers. By not having fingers is you cannot provide the day-to-day goods and services that make life and welfare so much higher in other countries. And that's why at the end of the day, you go through Havana, it looks like a poor, dilapidated city. And yes, basic food is provided. Yes, basic health services are provided because you have strong thumbs, but you don't have any fingers. Okay, so that's so much for the Cuban Revolution. A fascinating topic. I would love to talk about for hours and hours, but I don't want to extend too much. So let me focus instead on another couple of topics before we wrap up. And one of them is going to be the Chilean alternative. So Salvador Allende becomes the president of Chile on November 1970 after a contested three-way election against Radomiro Tomic, the leader of the Christian Democrats, and Jorge Alexandri, the leader of the right-wing parties. And because none of the three candidates wins an outright majority, the election goes to Congress, and their Christian Democrats decide to support Salvador Allende. It's kind of an interesting decision because on one hand, you could argue that Tomic and Alessandri were closer in terms of economic policy, but the Christian Democrats think that it's good that Allende and his Unidad Popular have a chance to govern, and also because the tradition in Chile was that if you were the winner of the election, even if you didn't have an outright majority, and Salvador Allende was a little bit ahead of votes with respect to Tomic and Alessandri, that should be the president elected by Congress. So they are both political and kind of half constitutional reasons for the Christian Democrats to do that. Salvador Allende comes from a background in a Chile where the previous president, Eduardo Frei, has been a Christian Democrat, has already tried to induce deep reforms in Chile. He calls that actually Revolución y Libertad, Revolution in Liberty. And if you want to read about it and phrase, I think that sometimes he's forgotten. This book by Sebastián Hurtado Torres is nice, The Gathering Storm, Eduardo Frey's Revolution in Liberty and Chile's Cold War. And if you want to read in Spanish, in this case, I'm going to cite a book in Spanish. There's not that much about Frey in English. Eduardo Frei Montalva, Un Gobierno Reformista a 50 años de la Revolución en Libertad, by Carlos Uneus and Javier Cuoso, editores. Allende, however, wants to go much farther than this revolution in liberty of the Christian Democrats, and really what he wants to do is the Chilean way to socialism, la vía chilena al socialism, with deep and aggressive agrarian reforms that will go way more than anything that Arbenz will have defended, so much closer to the ideas of Castro of collectivizing most of the agriculture, nationalization of industries. And this via chilena al socialismo is at the same time, or comes at the same time that a traditional boom and bust populist cycle, like the ones we described in the main lecture, that plagued much of Latin America since World War II. In fact, when Rudy Dorfusch and Sebastian Edwards came up with this idea of the boom and bust cycle, they look exactly at what happened in Chile during that time. That was kind of, in some sense, their prototypical evidence. Chile, the government, the Unidad Popular government, is going to start an extremely expansionary fiscal and monetary set of policies that are going to lead first to a fast output growth, which again is going to imply that during the first year of government, the Unidad Popular government is actually quite popular, but soon after to that very high inflation. And that's going to made worse by fluctuations in the price of copper, the main export of Chile, and by the political tensions. The Via Chilena al Socialismo creates a lot of opposition in the upper middle classes, in the traditional elites, and more in the army, who starts to be very concerned about what Chile is going to be. And of course, here, remember, we already discussed all the role of the CIA and to which extent, this coup by Pinochet was really pushed by the United States. I already also mentioned that Brazil also played quite a bit of role. My view is that Chilean generals had much more agency than what the traditional historiography gives them credit for, that they would have organized a coup, whether or not the US will have done anything about it, that in some sense, by ignoring this basic fact, we are removing agency from all the political actors in Chile that becomes a puppet on the hands of exterior forces. Now, it's hard to come up from a reading of the handling of macroeconomic policy in Chile in a very positive way. And in fact, part of the reason when democracy comes back in Chile in the late 1980s and 1990s, Chile is going to have a much more mainstream and orthodox policy is because many of the left-wing and centrist policymakers from 1970 to 1973 learned that this boom and bust cycle always ends poorly. And it's very interesting. You can read their own statements about them, and they say, no, what we realize is that the only way to really do redistribution in the long run is to keep a sensible fiscal and monetary policy, and that this whole ideas of nationalizing industries here and there is not really going anywhere. But just as an interesting aside, the Via Chile Socialism also had a few crazy ideas, and one that somehow has received some interest recently is the Project Cybersyn, inspired by Stratford Beer. So this chap was Stratford Beer. He was a believer in something called cybernetics, which was kind of a view about how to integrate computer science systems with societies and be able to use optimal control techniques. And he had this view of having this cybernetic way to do central planning in Chile, where instead of having an old-style ghost plan like in the Soviet Union, you will have this room over here. This is one of the few photographs left with this type of chairs, very, I guess, out of a Star Trek, and these screens over there where you will get some information in real time about the behavior of the Chilean economy. And I guess some economists over here, or cybernetic experts, system experts over here, putting these buttons will be able to control the economy. Of course, there are many reasons why this will have never worked, but the coup in 1973 by Pinochet prevented that from happening. If you want to read about it, the book Cybernetic Revolutionaries by Penn Medina is really a very, very interesting reading. I have even cited it. I have written some papers about central planning and arguing why computers will never solve the problem of central planning. And I think there's kind of a little bit of naivety in some quarters these days about it. And I have mentioned this book, and that, it will have not happened. Even if Stratford was completely wrong, this will have never worked. Anyway, so that's what we have in terms of the revolution. We have first in Guatemala, then in Cuba, then in Chile. And I'm also skipping a few other minor cases and guerrilla movements, but what you have clearly is the process of reaction. And in terms of the reaction, what you are going to have is the military coups. There are going to be many of them. Perhaps the three that people always have in mind are Brazil in 1964. You are going to have in Chile, I already mentioned Pinochet in 1973, and of course Videla and the juntas in Argentina after 1976. And these coups are very interesting from an economic policy perspective, because this is a new generation of military dictators. You don't have the old-fashioned caudillos. So for many decades in Latin America, which has had always a long tradition of military interventions, and this book by Alain Rouquier, The Military and the State in Latin America, make that case very nicely. Well, caudillos were basically, I'm the boss, or I'm a powerful general, and I want to be el presidente, and I give a coup, and I'm el presidente for the next 20, 25 years. No, that's not what these guys are after. You still have some kind of old-style caudillos, like Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay, but these are not old-fashioned caudillos. These are also not juntas, like the ones that have often happened in the history of Latin America, that are trying to fix in political impasses. So often in Latin America, what you have are situations where the political system cannot really work, especially in the time of the liberal oligarchic regimes, and then the military come and they kind of, the junta tries to break the political logjam and organizes an election maybe after 2, 3, 4 years. But what we are having over here is really a program of radical and thorough reordering of society, even by violent means. So the 1970s military governments are very different from previous ones. In fact, look at the way this was called in Argentina, Proceso de Reorganización Nacional, National Reorganization Process. And Guillermo O'Donnell has called these bureaucratic authoritarian regimes because these military officers are going to bring a lot of technocrats, of experts, to run their countries and accomplish this process of national reorganization. And the way you think about it is that this, in some sense, was bound to happen. This is not an accident. And the reason it's not an accident is because the Economic policy that starts in Latin America in the 1930s with import substitution and all the populism and everything else has made the state so essential in the working of Latin American economies that the fight for their control of these states becomes fierce. If you control the state, you control everything. If you don't control the state, you don't control anything. That's very different from Western Europe or the United States. In the United States, you don't control the state. It's okay. There is still a lot of things you can do with your life. You can still run a firm. You can still run a university. There are private universities. In Latin America, by the 1970s, everything depends on the government. So this is such a high-stake game that polarization becomes a little bit, in some sense, an unavoidable situation. The interesting thing, and this is also something that we have forgotten because of a lot of, I think, low-quality historiography over the last 20, 25 years, is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the way these regimes are going to work. So you're going to have Juan Velasco in Peru, who is a very left-wing dictator. He believes in land reform, the expropriation of foreign oil and mining companies. It actually has a close relation with the Soviet Union, purchasing weapons. This is a Sukhoi Su-22 of the Peruvian Air Force, you can see over there. And up to this day, a lot of the hardware of the Peruvian military comes from the Soviet Union, kind of a unique case in Latin America, except, of course, Cuba, and later on Nicaragua a little bit, and Venezuela more recently. And it's going to get the support of the Communist Party. You are going to have Brazil, who is going to have a developmental state with a very strong nationalist support of industries. And then you are going to have Chile with aggressive market reforms, but never privatization of the copper industry. And the reason I was saying is these days we don't have very good historiography is because everyone seems to be a little bit obsessed with Chile and their market reforms. And that kind of colors how we think about other military dictatorships, which were actually quite different. So what you really, really want to remember is this large heterogeneity. On the other hand, it's also important to recall that the evidence is that these military rulers are not going to be any better on average than the democratic rulers in terms of economic performance. And this book by Glenn B. Glaser, Guardians of the Nation, makes the point. So let me wrap up over here, quickly summarizing what we have done so far. What we have argued in this extra lecture is that we have this process of revolution that leads to a strong polarization, this military reaction, and I think that at the end of the day, by the mid-1980s, it's going to be very clear to everyone that neither the revolution nor the military dictatorships are really the path forward, that revolutions have not worked and that the military dictatorships have not worked either. And that's going to be, together with other issues that we are going to deal in future lectures, such as the crisis of the debt, lay down the foundations for the big reforms that we are going to see in Latin America in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Thank you.